Thank you. All right, let's start. So we're going to talk about carbohydrate and lipid chemistry. Anytime you talk about chemistry, it's not that fun, but we're trying to make it a little smoother. All right. So we're going to start with the carbohydrate. We have a little bit to cover, about 46 slides. So some areas I may go a little faster, but I'll slow down to explain a little more. So basically, the purpose of this course, this lecture today, is to give you a little bit of, remind you about the general chemistry, carbohydrate and lipid chemistries, to prepare you for the metabolism. And in the second section, we're going to talk about the introduction of metabolism. So carbohydrate, this is the major function, energy. So forms of storage, for instance, the glycogen, you're eating enough of sugars around, and then sometimes the sugar you utilize for energy purpose, but if you have it extra, it gets stored as a glycogen. But they have a structural role, cellulose in plant. So now, in cell recognition, you find some of those molecules on the cell surface that is utilized for recognition. They are carbohydrate polymers. You have your glycoproteins or proteoglycans, connective tissues. Now, they also play a role in signaling and so forth. And most importantly, we're going to talk about the blood and the 0, A and B blood types are associated with the presence of specific oligosaccharide that is, in the cell surface in the red blood cell. We're going to talk about, but that is very, very important in the blood transfusion. Somebody who is a 0 or A or B, you want to be careful when you give the blood transfusion. So I'm going to give you a little bit of information on that. So this is the monomers, the smallest, simplest sugars, monosaccharide, the glyceraldehyde. So, anytime we talk about sugar, simple, you have this aldehyde group. Those sugar carrying the aldehyde groups are called the aldose. And then now some of them carry a ketone group, the second carbon. In that case, you have your ketones, okay? And glucose and galactose and lactose we're going to talk about, like here. Now, I gave you the ring representation as opposed to the chain representation. I'm sure you've already seen that in general chemistry. So you can have a chain representation, but also in the ring. The reason I'm giving the ring, because anytime you have sugar in the solution, usually it's in the forms of rings like this. So these, you have your three most common one, glucopyranoses and the fructose pyranoses. So the 6 membrane rings and 5 membrane rings. Now, one thing you have to remember, glucose, mannose, and galactose, these are epimer of glucose. So basically, the difference between glucose and mannose and galactose is on 1 carbon. And that's one way you can quickly remember. If you know the structure of glucose, you can quickly identify mannose or galactose. So if you look at the glucose, this is carbon number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, CH2OH here. Now, this carbon is also important. And the next slide I want to talk about, but I pointed out here to you, carbon number 1 is also called the anomeric carbon. The alpha and the beta, when this OH is down or up, you have an alpha or beta, okay? Now, the 6 member ring are called the pyranoses, and the 5 member rings are called the pyranoses. Now, here you have your glucopyranose, mannopyranose, and galactopyranose. So one thing so quickly I want to point it out. So if you look at glucose, carbon number 1, OH is up, so that's a beta. If OH is down, that's alpha. Now, the carbon number 2 on the glucose, OH is down. 3 is up, 4 is down. So up, down. So if you can, for you to remember glucose structure. Now, the difference between mannose and glucose is directly carbon number 2. So if you know how to draw glucose structure, you take the carbon number 2 and you flip the OH up, that's your mannose. So if you have a glucose and you want to write down the galactose, only thing you have to do is carbon number 4 here, you take that and you flip it up, flip it down, and that is your galactose. Is that clear? So that is a simplistic way you can remember this thing. Now, fructopyranose is a little different. It's a single one. You can just memorize that as it is, okay? All right. So the 6 memory rings are called pyranose. The 5 memory rings are called pyranose, in case you say those. So again, I was talking about the anomeric carbons. The carbon number 1, when the OH is down, it's called the alpha. So you see alpha glucose. And if OH is up, see here, that's a beta glucose. All right? Same goes for galactose and mannose. All right, so you have your monosaccharide here, glucose. Now your disaccharide is maltose. Basically, the maltose 2 glucoses are linked together by 1,4-glycosidic linkage, okay? Now, and this is alpha 1,4. Now, the amylose, on the other hand, is a polymer of the glucose molecules, okay? Now, I pointed out some of these structure here, the phosphorylated form of the glucose, because once the glucose is there, it can be phosphorylated, it can have other group, amine group attached, and many other groups attached to it. So I want to give you an example that you may see, during coursework. At least you're not surprised. It gives you a little bit of idea. So here, I have phosphorylated forms of sugars. For instance, here, this is glycerol diphosphate, 3-phosphate, which is an intermediate of glycolysis, or even any metabolism where you have those intermediates in it. Like here, glucose 1-phosphate, glucogen glycolysis, and then the glucose 6-phosphate, you see that in glycolysis. Okay, so now you have other fructose 6-phosphate, you also see that in the glycolysis. So basically, in the fructose 6-phosphate, the phosphate is attached to 6 position. And here, the phosphate is attached to 6 position, as you see here. And here, the phosphate is attached to the 1st position. And on the glycerol 3-phosphate, the phosphate is attached to 3 position. Is that clear? Okay. So glycosidic, basically, you have your glucose molecule to which you have another functional group to it. In this case, you have a methyl group attached to it. So you have an alpha, because you have alpha, the OH is down, D-glucopyranose plus the methyl, so that's your methyl alpha D-glucose, okay? Now, one example of these are the glucosides. One example is the digitalis. I'm sure you're going to see that in cardio. A digitalis is a drug that is used, basically to help somebody with a heart condition, arrhythmia, and so forth, okay? The digitalis, I'm sure you're going to see that in the pharmacology. But what I want you to know, it is a glycoside. Now, you also have what's called your amino group sugars. So basically, you have your sugars here. In this case, you have an amino group attached to the 2nd carbon. So this is because the OH has a beta D glucose. It has a glucose and amine attached to it. So that's your glucosamine. And this is a building block for many others glucose molecules. For instance, in this case, this is the N-acetyl glucosamine. So you have an acetyl group attached to it. And here you have a lactic group attached to it, and so forth. Now you have both groups attached to this one. So this is your muraminic acid, and this is your N-acetyl muraminic acid. Okay? But this one is component of the peptidoglycan. You remember we discussed yesterday bacterial cell wall? So these are good component of bacterial cell wall. So they are monomers, so get attached in order to synthesize the bacterial cell wall. As you know, I said it yesterday, the cell was very important for bacteria to sustain osmotic pressure. So if the cell wall is not synthesized, so the bacteria is just susceptible to lysis. Now you have other derivatives again from your glucose, from a galactose in this case. Okay, so you see your galactose OH4 is up. So galactose, now you have an amino position 2. So you have your N-acetyl glucosamine and others. Now this one, as you can see, you also have not only have a methyl group attached, but you also have a sulfur group attached at the position 6 here. Okay? And another example is this: you have a different group attached to it called the sialic acid, and I thought I'd bring it out to you. It's used to treat wart on the skin on your food. Okay, so this is the ingredient for that. So they are component of the chondroitin and keratin sulfate in the connective tissues and so forth. I'm going to give you an example of those as we go. Okay. So now you have other sulfoglutamate here. So as you see, this one, you have a sulfate group here. You can have one single one attached. You have a disulfate and trisulfate. Okay, and then the positions are indicated. Now, we discussed the monosugar, so we're going to discuss the disaccharides. This is the one common one. You have your sucrose. I'm sure all of you heard about sucrose, which is the glucose and fructose, a length about 1,2 linkage. This is your lactose, milk sugar, contain galactose and the glucose, and the linkage is a 1,4 linkage. So between carbon number 1 and carbon number 4. But it is 1,4 linkage. Now, the maltose, as I mentioned earlier, you have 2 glucoses linked by 1,4 linkage. This is alpha 1,4 linkage. Okay. Here you have your beta 1,4 linkage. Okay. Now, the polysaccharide. No, we mentioned the monosaccharide, the disaccharide. Now we talk about polysaccharide, glycogen or glucose storage. Amylosis, amylopectin, and glycogen. Glycogen, in our body, that's our storage form of glucose. Amylosis, amylopectin, you find those on the plant. But cellulose, also, which is another polymer, you find this in the plant, and this is the lower organism, and so fungi as a ketone. And the glucosamine, you find this in animals, as I mentioned, and connective tissues and so forth. So those are polysaccharides. So I brought these two to give you an idea. The amylopectin is a polysaccharide. We can digest this. Okay, if you take a starch polymer of. But one big difference between the amylopectin and cellulose. You know the cellulose in the plant for structural role. One big difference is alpha 1,4 here and the beta 1,4 linkage. Because of this structure. So you see the linkage, basically the linkage, the OH was up before, so OH is up here. So beta 1,4, alpha 1,4, that is the difference. Because of that, we have enzyme to digest this. We don't have enzyme to digest it. That is why when you eat salad, people eat the salad for diet because you're taking all these sugars in, but you can't digest it because you don't have an enzyme. You guys probably can come out with one way to stimulate that enzyme in our body, if you can, biotechnology, right? So if you can get the enzymes, synthesize the enzyme and get it to us to digest the cellulose so we can eat, plant leaves and stuff and digest and get sugars out of it. But for now, we can't do it because we don't have an enzyme that clips this. Is that clear? Good. So remember that, just beta 1,4, alpha 1,4. All right. So these are physiological style structures, specifically the chondral sulfate, keratin sulfate, which are part of the connective tissues, cartilage and so forth. Now the dermatan sulfate in the skin, heparins, and cell surface, these are kind of anticoagulants, just like a heparin I talk about. But they are repeat unit of disaccharide. Like for instance, you see here, you have N-acetyl galactosamine 6 sulfate, you see here, and this is glucuronic acid. So this repeat here, glucuronic acid and acetyl galactosamine 6 phosphate, repeat on and on, as you see another one here, and then continue, okay? So they are repeat of the disaccharide. Those are in the chondral sulfate. Now, the keratin sulfate, as you see here, similar observation, N-acetyl galactosamine 6 phosphate. Now you have a galactose. So now a disaccharide, a repeat, that's a component of the keratin sulfate. Now, hyaluronic acid, on the other hand, you have your N-acetyl N-acetyl glucose, and you have your glucuronic acid. So those dipeptides repeat. So basically, it's components of the glucuronic acid. Okay. So you have all those, for instance, the heparin, as I mentioned. So repeat the glucuronic acid and glucosamine, uric acid and glucosamine. So you find them in the heparin. Heparin, you're going to talk about heparin a lot when you're working in the clinical lab, I'm sure, because heparin is an anticoagulant, and it's a repeat of this disaccharide, okay? And same as the heparan sulfate in your skin, in different tissues in your body. So that's your natural antioxidant in your body where, for your blood not to coagulate, okay? So those two, as I said, they are repeat unit of these disaccharide. Now, the N and O linkage, I'm sure you're going to hear these a lot. So what I want you to understand, sometimes you have a proteins on the cell surface and a membrane, integral proteins. They get glycosylated, right? I'm sure you heard of that. So your linkage can either occur in as far as, the alpha, the amino acid in the protein that is linked to the oligosaccharide can either be asparagine or threonine, okay? So asparagine, you have this amine group. So the linkage between the oligosaccharide and your proteins occur through the asparagine, through this amine group. So it is called the N linkage, okay? Now, if the linkage occur and you have a threonine in your proteins, and the linkage occur between your oligosaccharide and your protein via the threonine, so because the threonine has an OH in it, so this will lead to what's called the O linkage. Is that clear? So the O linkage involves asparagine, and the N linkage include asparagine, but the O linkage involves the threonine. Is that clear? And threonine is a part of the proteins, okay, that to which the oligosaccharide is attached to. Is that clear? Good. All right, so those are mentioned. Now, this is something important, and I'll put it out there. I think you should know it. It's very, very important. Human blood type, due to the structure of sugars. Now, one thing you have to remember, as I mentioned on the others, you have, in this case, you have oligosaccharide here. Now, you have your N-acetyl glucose and galactose and the fructose here. So this repeat. Now, you have, these oligosaccharide, the simple ones like this, composed of 2 monosaccharide, it's the type O, okay? You have this N-acetyl glucosamine, galactose, and fructose. Now, that's your type O. But now the difference, the type O look like a type A. It also look like a type B, but with a small difference. And that small difference is the N-acetyl galactosamine for the type A. So type A has N-galactosamine on top of the everything else that the type O has. So this single sugar. Now the type B also has a galactose on top of everything that the type O has. So these different create a kind of antigenic property. So somebody who has a type O basically has an antibody against it. So you do not want to give them the type A blood or type B blood. If not, they will, the person will react. Now you can give type O to these guys because the fact that the type O doesn't have any extra, they have the same sugar molecule as the type O, so they don't have any antibody against the type A. Is that clear? Good. So that's why when you're giving the blood to people, they make sure you type the person's blood type first before they get the blood transfusion, because the person has an antibody, can develop an antibody. So I have this chart here for you. The person with the type A blood make antibody against A and B. The person who has type A blood make antibody against B. The person who has a B antigen make antibody against A. And the person who has a B, none of them, okay? So that is, you can read the rest just to give you an idea. And this portion, I think it was very important for you to know in this sugar stuff. Okay? Any question on this? I'll move on to lipids. All right, so let's move on to lipids. Lipids, just like you have your carbohydrate, you have your simple ones, your fatty acids, and then you have your complex one, triacylglycerol, for instance. Triacylglycerol is your body storage of fat, okay? So instead of just synthesizing single fatty acid deposit, they can attach to a glycerol backbone. The 3 fatty acids attached to, so that's your triacyl 3 fatty acid attached to a glycerol backbone. Now you have your phospholipid. These are biological membrane lipids, lipid bilayer. So phospholipid, it has a head group that is hydrophilic, the phosphates in it, and a tail group, 2 fatty acids, in the tail. So those 2 fatty acids then form the bilayer with the phosphate group oxide, which show, they interact with the water because they're hydrophilic. Okay, so those are your phospholipids. But the sphingolipid are also part of the biological membrane, but also mostly found in the nervous tissues and so forth. Now, eicosanoic acid are biological regulators and the inflammatory responses. We're not going to talk about this much because you're going to discuss next year when you go second year. Okay. But these, the remaining, we're going to talk about those. So this is your fatty acid here. As you look at it, you have a long hydrocarbon tail, but the head group has a carboxylic group. Now, it's an acid, that's why it's called a fatty acid, okay? For this one, can release a proton. It can be protonated, but it can release proton and so forth. So it has a pKa value, if you recall your acid-base chemistry, okay? So now the pKa is 4.8. So what happened to this group here in terms of accepted proton release at pH equal to 2? What is it going to look like? Protonated or unprotonated? Protonated, right? So now you can imagine, so your blood pH is a 7.4. So if you take this and put it in the blood pH, in what form is it going to look like? Unprotonated or protonated? Unprotonated, thank you. All right. So naturally occurring fatty acid have an even number of carbon. All right. So we have your first fatty acid here, the stearic acid. Stearic acid has 18 carbon, okay? Again, it has this carboxylic group here. Now, the systematic name, the fact that it has an 18 carbon is called 18 point, which means 0.0 because it doesn't have any double bond, okay? So the 0 here means it doesn't have any double bonds, okay? So the first number is a carbon number, and the second number is basically the double bonds, if it has one or not. Okay, and the abbreviation 18.0, the systematic name octadecanoic acid, and the common name is stearic acid. Now the next one, as you see here, and that is your linoleic acid. Common name, and again, it's 18 carbon, just like a stearic acid, but with a difference, it has a double bond set, okay? So as you see here, so the systematic name is a 6,6,9,12 octadecanoic 18 carbon, the 6 conformation. Now the double bonds in the position 9 carbon, and the position 12, okay? So the abbreviation, so 18 carbon, and it has 2 double bonds and the position of double bonds, okay, for the nomenclature. Okay. So, so this is our unsaturated fatty acid. Okay. Now, so fatty acid, so it's a general nomenclature here. So now you also can name that based on the omega end. So one thing I have to mind you here is that, sometimes when you're naming the carbon, you started from the carboxyl group, okay? And that's your carbon number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way to 18. So now you're going to see the alpha carbon, the beta carbon, and so forth. So what you have to remember, the carboxyl group is a carbon number 1. Now the second carbon here, carbon number 2, is the alpha carbon, okay? So keep that in mind. So the alpha carbon is not the carbon, the first carbon, it is the second one, beta, and so forth. Is that clear? And this is going to make sense when you start talking about the beta oxidation. So the beta oxidation, you have the oxidation occur in the carbon number 3, which is the beta carbon. All right? So now, there is another nomenclature now started with the methyl end, okay? So the methyl end, as you see here, so this is the omega 1, 2, 3, 4, so forth. So as you can see, so look at this one, for instance. So it's telling you the omega, the double bond position, so it's at number 9. But if you look at the omega, so omega 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay? So that is omega 9. Should I back up on this one? So instead of starting from here, 1, 2, 3, all the way to 9, like in this case, 1, 2, all the way 9. And same when you start on this end, the middle end, you also end up with a 9 here. So not only it's a delta 9, but it's also omega 9. Is that clear? Omega 9 because it's not. Now, let's go to the next one and start making much more sense to you. Let's look at this. This is omega 3, which means the first double bond you see is at position number 3, started from the omega end. Okay? So omega 1, 2, 3. Okay? I'm sure you heard about omega 3, omega 6, those are good essential fatty acids and so forth. All right, good. So that's why, the nomenclature, you start counting from the methyl end, not from the carboxyl end, but the methyl end, okay? But in this case, for instance, this is omega 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, okay? So that is your omega 6. Okay. So now you know the omega 3 and 6 fatty acid, the nomenclature occur. All right. So now this one, how would you name this fatty acid? So if you look at it here, you have a carbon number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, right? So it is omega 9. So if you want to look at it on the carboxyl end, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Let me repeat it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So that is delta 9 by omega 7. Is that clear? Okay. Again, omega is start from the methyl end and counting. When you hit the first double bond, that carbon, it's your omega carbon. All right? So saturated fat, unsaturated. So saturated fat, basically saturated with the hydrogen. There is no double bonds on it. That's your saturated fatty acid, okay? And one common example, as we mentioned, is this the stearic acid, which is a fully saturated 18 carbon, okay? No double bond. You do not count this double bond as a double bond, okay? It's a double bond with an hydrocarbon tail, okay? All right, so now unsaturated fatty acid. So if you look at this, so this is the oleic cis 9-octadecanoate. Another thing I want to bring it to your attention is the cis versus trans, and we're going to talk about a little more. So this one, oleic acid, so the cis double bond, so basically both hydrogen within it, in the other part of the double bonds are in the same position, and the trans is opposite, right? I think I have an example I'm going to show you. So in a human, a majority of fatty acids saturated or monounsaturated, okay? So that's why we're, fats from animals or us, at the room temperature, they're solid. They're not that. So the more double bond you have in the fatty acid, you have the fat become much more fluid. That is why oil, the vegetable oils and stuff, they have a much more double bonds in it. That's why they're fluid at the room temperature, okay? So which one in a vegetable oil is one of them that is very much fluid, and that is your olive oil. So it has a lot of double bonds containing fatty acids. Okay, that's why they're much more. So now your cis and trans, as I mentioned, and trans fatty acids are straight. Now the hydrogen, because here, if you have a double bond, you have one hydrogen here and one hydrogen, and they're the opposite direction across the lines of the hydrocarbon tail. While the cis ones The hydrogen here and the hydrogen there are both in the same position, in the same direction. Is that clear? So that creates a kind of band in the molecule, so they cannot pack together very well. That's why if you have a cis double bond, especially in oil, vegetable oil and in olive oil, you have a lot of cis double bond pointing in the same direction, so they cannot pack together. That's why the fat here is fluid. Okay. Now, if you have a trans, so they are straight, you can nicely pack them together and then remain solid in room temperature. Is that clear? And same as the saturated, the fact that they are straight, you know, if you have a paper that is just flat and clean, straight, you can pack them together, right? But when they are wrinkled and stuff, they won't pack very well together. Same thing concept here. When you have a double bond, the cis one, the fact that they are kinky, they cannot be packed very well, so they become fluid in the oil. In the butter, you have a trans fat or saturated fat, so they are solid and they can be nicely packed together. Okay? So now, this one is good for you and this one is bad for you, okay? And the reason it's been involved with the heart disease if you take a lot of foods with the trans fat or saturated fat, okay? And there is a study that says that, you know, when you're eating too much of trans fat or saturated fat, it really increases your not only your the disease, heart disease risk, but also even the death from any other disease, okay? I have a study for it, but we're probably going to talk about that next year, okay? So what you have to remember, it is involved with the heart disease if you're eating too much trans fat and saturated fat. But oil, vegetable oil is good for you, so you may want to increase those in your diet and decrease the saturated and trans fat in your diet. Is that clear? Okay. Now, we already talked about this, so the physiology. As I said, the fact that the pKa value is 4.5, so they will be in this form in the blood pH condition. All right. So another thing you have to remember is that the fluidity, the melting temperature. So the melting temperature is the temperature at which the fat is in the fluid state, you know. So it turns out the fluidity also depends on the length of the chain. So if you have a shorter chains, it doesn't take a higher temperature for them to be fluid, okay? But if you have a longer chain, so it takes them a higher temperature to be fluid. And in this case, the carbic acid, this molecule only 10 carbons. So it only takes 31 degrees Celsius, 0.6 in order to be fluid. But look at the stearic acid. It has to be 60 or 70 degrees before it starts, getting fluid. Is that clear? So at the room temperature, the stearic acid will be solid, and this may be slightly fluid. Okay. Now the increased double bond, the number of double bond, but in this case, as I mentioned, it's a cis double bond. So if you have more cis double bond, so the temperature required for the molecule to be fluid decreases. Okay. So now, look at this guy. Even though they are the same chain length, it takes these to be fluid at because they have one double bond. The melting temperature is 16 degrees, so it's going to be fluid in the room temperature. But look at this one, the linoleic acid. Even in the freezing condition, it's going to be fluid, which is great, right? So as you see, the temperature is a minus 11 degrees Celsius. Even if you put it in the refrigerator, it'll still be slightly fluid. Okay? Is this clear? Now, your triacylglycerol. Now, what I was saying, these are the storage form. If you take somebody's fat cells, you're going to find a bunch of these in your fat cell storage in there. Okay? So that is storage form. Now, the fact that the oil also is a storage form of fat for the plant, so oil are also in this structure to triacylglycerol, a glycerol backbone with 3 fatty acids attached to it. Okay? So, and they are storage for energy purpose. For instance, somebody who is nicely well-fed, he will store, let's say summertime, you're not doing anything. But now you're working hard, okay? So you lose weight because you're spending a lot of energy. In summertime, you go home, relax, mom feeds you, and suddenly you start storage, a lot of energy. It's going to be stored in this form, right? by the time you count, the chicks a little puffy and so forth. So now your membrane lipids. So as I said, the biological membranes, bilayers, are composed of lipids. But now those lipids, the special ones, they have one edge that is hydrophobic and but another edge that is hydrophilic, okay, which is understandable. Because when you have your bilayer, you know, you have one layer here, one layer, okay? So this layer has a hydrophobic tail. This layer has a hydrophobic, so those hydrophobic tails come together because they don't want to be in contact with the water. So the fats come together. Now the head group, the fact that they're hydrophobic, they go outside of the layer. So they will be in contact either inside the cell or outside the cell, okay? Because they are in contact with the water. But between the two, you know, there is a hydrophobic core there. Is that clear? Okay. So now so this portion is going to be within the membrane, and this other portion is going to be facing this, and then so you have it. Now this edge is going to be outside of the cell or inside of the cell to form the bilayer. Okay. So these are your now the backbone is the glycerol phosphate. Okay. So you have a glycerol. Now the OH here and the OH, these two are going to receive the fatty acid as you see here. Okay. So R1 and R2 basically are the fatty acids. Okay. And R3 in the phospholipids, R3 is going to be hydrophilic molecule. Phosphate plus another groups, and this other group also is hydrophilic to make this head group area even more hydrophilic. Is that clear? So, example, you have your glycerol phospholipids. So now the R1 and R2, you know, include carbon, you know, 16 to 24. A fatty acid with a 16 to 24 carbon with a 0 to 6 double bonds. Okay. Now, you also have other forms of glycerol phospholipids. So you have your glycerol backbone, and you see here you have a R1, one fatty acid, another fatty acid. Now you see the head groups here, okay? So this head group is a choline. So now you have your phosphatidic acid, to which you have a choline attached. This entire group is the choline. So this is the phosphatidyl choline. Okay. And phosphatidyl is this. That is the one I showed to you earlier, as you see here. You know, so the glycerol phosphate. So now your phosphatidic acid is with the two fatty acid attached to the glycerol backbone. That's your phosphatidic acid. Now you can choose. So the difference in the glycerol phosphate. So these portions are almost always the same. The difference is going to be what group you attach at this end. Okay. Now in this case, example, we have a choline inside, which is nicely hydrophilic. Now the next group is the sphingolipids. And again, this is important stuff you need to know, and I like to ask questions on these things. So you need to recognize these guys. So sphingolipids is this one. This area look like, but there is a significant difference between the sphingolipid and the glycerol phospholipid. So the sphingosine is the building block. It has the amine groups to it. Okay, the long chain aliphatic chain we have OH and OH. But here it has this amine group to it. Now the amine group can accept a fatty acid. So once you have a one fatty acid attached to the amine group here, like it here, it is called ceramide. Okay, so ceramide is the sphingosine plus fatty acid. Is that clear? Is that clear? Good. All right. So now you have your ceramide, which is a sphingosine plus a fatty acid attached to the amine group. So here, your sphingomyelin, you have the phosphate group with the choline here attached to your sphingosine. So that's your sphingomyelin. Okay. So sphingomyelin is a sphingosine to which you have phosphocholine attached to. Okay. And as I said, this is a component of the myelin sheath. It plays a role in biological signal. And ceramide is a very, very important molecule, so you need to know this, okay? So now you can have your sphingosine with the R group attached and the another fatty acid. So basically your ceramide plus sugar molecules here can be glucose or galactose. So those are your cerebroside, okay? Commonly found in the brain and so forth. So ceramide plus a carbohydrate. Now I give you a list here. So you have your sphingolipids, example sphingolipid. We're going to discuss this. Choline attached to ceramide, or if you have a galactose attached to a ceramide, so that's your galactocerebroside. Now, if you have this even a more complex oligosaccharide attached to a ceramide, so that's your ganglioside. And these molecules, sometimes when you have you degrade them because they get metabolized. So sometimes if you lack an enzyme for their metabolism, that can lead to serious disorder. I'm sure you're going to see those very soon. Okay, so the gangliosides and so forth. Now, cholesterol, on the other hand, if you recall, we mentioned cholesterol yesterday. Cholesterol synthesized from acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA is the end product of fatty acid breakdown. But conversely, it is a building block for fatty acid. Okay. So same thing for cholesterol. Cholesterol is synthesized from acetyl-CoA. So cholesterol has these four rings here. It has this long aliphatic tail. But one thing you have to remember is this OH group. So this portion is a highly hydrophobic, but this portion is slightly hydrophilic because of the OH. Because OH group can form hydrogen bond with the water. So in other words, it is a component of the biological membrane. It plays a big time role in the stability of the membrane. So cholesterol is not a bad thing as it is. You just don't want too much of it, but you need enough for some biological role. So it increases the stiffness of the membrane, the biological membrane. So as you see the biological membrane, as I mentioned to you, you have your head groups here, hydrophilic, and you have your tail area, hydrophobic. So one head group here, and the second layer head group is inside and outside. So those are hydrophobic tails are here, and you have your cholesterol. So you see the cholesterol is stick slightly next to the hydrophobic the head groups. This portion of the cholesterol is hydrophobic, so it's stick inside the hydrophobic core. But this portion hydrophilic, you see that portion is slightly stick next to the hydrophilic head groups. Is that clear? So, and then if you want to make a cholesterol completely hydrophobic, so you have to attach a fatty acid here. So that's the cholesterol ester. So that becomes much more hydrophobic, and those can be carried to different mechanisms. Okay, so it plays a role. Cholesterol in biological membrane basically not only influence the stiffness of the membrane, become much more sturdy, but also the fact that you make it much more sturdy, sometimes it makes it difficult for molecule to go across the membrane. So that's why if you have too much cholesterol in your biological membrane, so it can affect the fluidity, so molecule will not be able to traverse, to go across the membrane very fluently. And as I said, even the small ions, it becomes harder for them to go through. Okay. So now cholesterol also a precursor for many biological secondary molecule. Hormones, for instance, your steroid hormones, testosterone, progesterone, estrogen, they are cholesterol-based, and some vitamins, and so forth, they are cholesterol-based, okay? So as I said, cholesterol is not that bad. It just needs to be controlled, okay? So any question at this point? I know we're going to talk about more next year about this, furthermore, some other aspects of it. But for now, I think this is more than enough for you to handle. And any questions at this point? You have 5 minutes. No question? All right.
Would you mind giving a different description of the difference between glycerophospholipids and phosphoacyl glycerols?
Glycerophospholipid here? And which one? The sphingolipid? Oh, the glycerophospholipid. So basically what I'm saying, this is the general structure here of the glycerol 3-phosphate. This is the backbone. So this is the backbone. Now you attach a fatty acid to these two OHs here. So once you do that, it becomes what's called the phosphatic acid. With phosphatic acid, that's what I have on this slide here. The phosphatic acid. Now you can take the phosphate group and attach a lot of different groups on it. So now that's going to be your glycerol phospholipids. Yeah. So, and as I said, these fatty acids, let's go back, probably make much more sense. These fatty acids are the tail in the biological membrane. So they stick together within the membrane. And these head groups, those big black ones, the blue ones outside, inside the cell. So these are hydrophilic, because inside the cell there is water there, outside the cell there is water there, okay? So the fact that they're both aqueous to the environment, so the hydrophobic tails do not want to be in contact. And this is one of the reasons your biological membrane stay intact, because your fatty acids do not want to be in contact. And that force that drive them to stay together, keep the biological membrane stable. Exactly, just like you have in a protein, if you recall from, I think, an early discussion, you know, the proteins stay in their folded conformation because of the hydrophobic force that is holding them together. They run away, hydrophobic molecules run away from water, and that force for them to stay together really keep them. And same thing goes for the biological membrane. They stay together because the hydrophobic tails do not want to be in contact with water. They want to stay with each other, and that stabilize the biological membrane. Now your cholesterol now comes and even stabilize, because cholesterol basically is like a wedges between those molecules, so them they can stick together very well and make them stable. Is that clear? But if you stick so much cholesterol between them, so they become even so hard that even a small molecule cannot go through. All right? Does that answer your question? All right, good. Anyway, I'm going to be here too. We have another lecture within a few minutes. So if you don't have any more questions, I can take up 5 minutes. Those people who's the enzymes, questions, the enzyme, the uncompetitive, if they have a question, I'll be happy to answer at this point.
I have a question. So are you saying that glycerol 3-phosphate is the same thing as phosphatidic acid?
No. Glycerol 3-phosphate is not the same as it's an initial step for the phosphatic acid formation. The glycerol phosphate plus 2 fatty acid is the phosphatic acid. Is that clear? Where was the question coming from? Okay. No, it's not the same. So you have your glycerol phosphate to 2 fatty acid attached to, that's your phosphatidic acid. Okay? Thank you.